Before the Hall of Fame honors, before the sold-out arenas, Wanderlei Silva's face was a road map of violence. Years of savage wars had flattened his nose, carved deep ridges above his eyes, and left so much scar tissue that his eyelids drooped. He fought through it all, smiling as he stomped and kneed his way into MMA history. But the damage became impossible to ignore. Doctors rebuilt his nose with part of his rib, scraped bone from his skull, and pulled back the skin above his eyes so he could see and breathe again. This is the story of the axe murderer, the rise, the reign, the scandals, and the surgery that changed everything. Long before the plastic surgery and the bright lights of global MMA, Wanderlei, born on July 3, 1976, his childhood was defined by a working-class grind. His family owned a small bar, and by the time he was just 3 years old, he was helping around the place, soaking in the loud, chaotic atmosphere of drunken patrons, street scuffles, and the kind of raw human drama that would later mirror his fighting style. Curitiba, in the 1980s, wasn't the kind of environment where you avoided confrontation. Street fights were part of the social currency, and Silva, even as a young boy, understood that physical dominance meant safety and respect. By his own account, he got into countless scraps before ever stepping foot in a gym. These weren't friendly scuffles. They were unpredictable, dangerous, and sometimes brutal. Wanderlei would later tell his own son, "You never know someone's health. One punch on the street and they could fall, hit their head, and die." That was wisdom born from first-hand experience. At 13, a twist of fate led him to the legendary Shootbox Academy. At the time, he was shy, unsure of himself, and far from the ferocious figure he would become. But Shootbox was no ordinary gym. It was a crucible. The likes of Ninja Rua, Shogun Rua, and Anderson Silva would all pass through those doors. But Wanderlei found his home there early. The gym was a meat grinder of sparring sessions where bruises and blood were part of the daily routine. If you couldn't take punishment, you didn't last. Silva took to Muay Thai instantly. The aggression that once got him into trouble in the streets now had a structure. His coaches encouraged relentless forward pressure, drilling into him the philosophy that the best defense was to overwhelm your opponent so completely they had no chance to mount offense. Alongside Muay Thai, he began dabbling in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to prepare for the hybrid demands of vale tudo, Brazil's no-holds-barred fighting style. By the time he was in his late teens, Silva had also served in the Brazilian military, where his reputation as a fearless fighter only deepened. He wasn't just another kid from Curitiba anymore. He was a disciplined combatant with the ability to channel pure aggression into a strategy. The foundation was set, a relentless forward march, no retreat, no compromise. This was the young man who would soon step into the most dangerous fighting arenas in the world. In the mid-1990s, before MMA became a regulated sport with weight classes, time limits, and safety protocols, Brazil's vale tudo scene was a violent underground proving ground. For Wanderlei Silva, it was the perfect place to sharpen his teeth. At just 19 or 20 years old, he began fighting professionally. Not because it was glamorous, it wasn't, but because it was one of the few ways a Muay Thai fighter could make real money. Muay Thai titles didn't pay, but vale tudo did. The rules, if you could call them that, were almost non-existent. Headbutts, groin strikes, hair pulling, it was all fair game. And Silva thrived in this chaos. Fighting in events like the International Vale Tudo Championship, IVC, he wore nothing but tiny trunks, his body smeared with sweat and blood, marching forward with the same cold glare that would later terrify opponents on the world stage. He delivered headbutts with savage precision, stomped grounded opponents, and threw knees designed to break more than just the opponent's guard. One of his early IVC fights became infamous when he headbutted opponent Artur Mariano, opening a massive cut, and continued to attack until the fight was stopped. These were the kinds of performances that earned him his nickname, the Axe Murderer. It wasn't just a catchy moniker, it captured the way he fought. He didn't just try to win, he tried to destroy. Inside the Vale Tudo rings, Silva began to refine the key elements of his style: an aggressive forward march, hooks thrown from every angle, a clinch game that transitioned into skull-cracking knees, and an unshakable mental toughness. He was learning how to break opponents not just physically, but mentally. In Brazil, his reputation grew quickly. Promoters knew putting him on a card meant chaos and ticket sales. Opponents knew facing him meant pain, and the small but passionate fan base of Vale Tudo recognized him as something rare, a fighter whose violence felt both reckless and calculated. The next step was inevitable. His brutal success in the underground made him a prime candidate for the emerging global stage of MMA, and soon the UFC would come calling. By 1998, the UFC was still a far cry from the polished organization fans know today. It was transitioning from its bare-knuckle roots into a sanctioned sport, but the roster was still filled with killers. Wanderlei Silva entered this arena at UFC Brazil, where he faced a young Vitor Belfort, a man whose hand speed was legendary. What happened next was a shock for the rising Brazilian star. Belfort sprinted across the cage and unleashed a blistering combination that overwhelmed Silva in just 44 seconds. It was a humbling moment. Many fighters might have retreated from the spotlight after such a loss, but Silva was wired differently. Just months later, he returned to the octagon and scored a brutal first-round knockout, proving that the Belfort fight was a setback, not a death sentence. That win earned him a title shot against Tito Ortiz for the UFC Light Heavyweight Championship. The Ortiz fight was a grueling affair. Silva showed flashes of his future dominance, but Ortiz's wrestling and control earned him a decision win. Despite the loss, Silva proved he belonged with the sport's elite. He had fought the UFC's best and held his ground. More importantly, the experience gave him valuable lessons about pacing, takedown defense, and the business side of MMA. But the UFC in the late 90s wasn't ready to make Silva a star. The promotional muscle wasn't there yet, and his style, though thrilling, needed the right stage to truly shine. That stage would not be in America, at least not yet. Opportunity knocked from across the Pacific. In a place where soccer kicks, stomp, Japan was the epicenter of MMA's wildest era. The rules allowed soccer kicks, stomps, and knees to the head of grounded opponent, exactly the kind of weapons Silva had perfected in Brazil. In pride, he wouldn't just compete, he would become the face of the organization. From 2000 to 2006, Silva went on one of the most dominant runs in MMA history. He became the Pride middleweight champion and defended his belt with ruthless efficiency. His style was pure forward pressure, no feeling out process, no dancing on the outside. Silva would stalk his opponents, cut off the ring, and trap them against the ropes before unloading knees in the clinch and hooks in tight exchanges. His trilogy with Japanese icon Kazushi Sakuraba cemented his legacy early. Sakuraba was beloved in Japan for his victories over the Gracie family, but against Silva, he was completely outgunned. The axe murderer tore through him with ferocity, breaking faces and spirits in front of sold-out arenas. Japanese fans, even as they saw their hero battered, couldn't look away. Then came one of the most famous stare-downs in MMA history, Silva versus Mirko "Cro Cop" Filipovic in 2002. Cro Cop, a former anti-terrorism police officer and elite kickboxer, was one of the few men whose aura of danger matched Silva's. For once, Wanderlei found himself on the receiving end of an unblinking, ice-cold glare. The fight was a war of tactics and power that ended in a draw, leaving fans desperate for more. By late 2004, the seemingly unstoppable Wanderlei Silva began to feel the wear and tear of years spent in constant war. His first major setback came when he faced heavyweight Mark Hunt in a non-title fight. Giving up nearly 80 pounds to the towering K1 veteran, Silva fought bravely, landing big shots and holding his own, but ultimately lost a controversial split decision. The result stung, not just because of the loss, but because it showed that even Silva's legendary aggression had limits against bigger, fresher opponents. In 2005, he entered Pride's middleweight Grand Prix, advancing to face Ricardo Arona in the semi-finals. Arona's smothering grappling style frustrated Silva, and he dropped a decision, his first official loss at 205 pounds in Pride. Though he would avenge that defeat in a rematch later that year, the cracks in his dominance were showing. But perhaps the most bizarre and talked-about moment of his career happened not in the ring, but backstage. On December 31st, 2005, before his rematch with Arona, Silva's team got into an altercation with American fighter Charles "Crazy Horse" Bennett. Accounts vary, but what's agreed upon is this. Bennett was choked unconscious by Shootbox's jiu-jitsu coach, Cristiano Marcelo. When he woke up, still groggy, he sucker-punched Silva, knocking the Pride champion out cold in the locker room just minutes before his fight. Silva regained his senses, walked out to the ring, and fought a grueling 20-minute battle to victory. For many, it became a bizarre testament to his toughness. But the blows kept coming. In 2006, Silva stepped into the ring against Crow Cop again, this time in the openweight Grand Prix semi-finals. Crow Cop, in peak form, landed a head kick so perfectly timed and brutally executed that Silva collapsed instantly. It was a career-altering knockout, one that would be replayed for years. Months later, Dan Henderson delivered another crushing KO, taking Silva's Pride middleweight title. The aura of invincibility was gone. The man who had terrified opponents with his relentless pace was now human. And in MMA, once the mystique fades, it rarely returns in full. And as Pride itself began to crumble, Silva faced a new crossroads. When Pride closed its doors, Wanderlei Silva returned to the UFC in 2007. Fans erupted with excitement at the announcement of his long-awaited clash with Chuck Liddell, a dream fight years in the making. The bout lived up to the hype, with both men trading bombs for 3 thrilling rounds. Liddell won the decision, but Silva's stock remained high thanks to his fearless performance. However, years of damage had taken a visible toll. By this point, Silva's face told the story of his career. Flattened nose, drooping eyelids from scar tissue, and a forehead carved from hundreds of stitches. His breathing was impaired, and he was prone to cuts that ended fights prematurely. In 2009, he made a life-changing decision: facial reconstructive surgery. Surgeons took cartilage from his rib to rebuild his nose, scraped bone from his skull to reduce swelling-prone areas, and removed excess scar tissue above his eyes to improve his vision. The results were dramatic. His breathing improved by 30%, but his appearance changed so much that fans were stunned when he returned. The axe murderer didn't quite look like the same man, but he was determined to prove he still fought like him. Post-surgery, Silva produced moments of brilliance. He destroyed Keith Jardine in under a minute, reminding fans of his violent efficiency. He earned a hard-fought win over Michael Bisping in 2010, showcasing his improved conditioning. But there were also setbacks: knockout losses to Quinton Jackson and Chris Lieben, as well as a decision loss to Rich Franklin. Each fight seemed to be a gamble between a flash of the old killer instinct and the reality of years of accumulated damage. By this stage, Silva was more than just a fighter. He was a living relic of MMA's most violent era. Every time he walked into the octagon, fans knew they might witness a knockout, one way or the other. And while the wins grew fewer, his willingness to trade in the pocket never changed. But the sport was evolving, and the wars of his past had left scars that even surgery couldn't erase. The final act of his career would bring both one last great battle and the scandal that changed everything. By 2013, Wanderlei Silva was no longer the unstoppable axe murderer of the Pride days, but he still had one more great war left in him. That fight came against Brian Stann at UFC on Fuel TV 8 in Saitama, Japan, the same arena where he'd once ruled Pride's golden age. The matchup was expected to be violent, but few could have predicted just just how wild it would get. From the opening bell, both men abandoned defense in favor of pure offense. They traded bombs in the center of the ring, each looking for the kill shot. Stann's power staggered Silva more than once, but the Brazilian legend's chin, though dented by years of abuse, somehow held up. The first round alone was a back-and-forth firefight that had the crowd roaring like it was 2003 all over again. In the second round, Silva found his rhythm. Backed up against the ropes, he unleashed a classic axe-murderer combination: hooks, uppercuts, and a perfectly timed right hand that dropped Stann to the canvas. Without hesitation, Silva pounced, raining down punches until the referee stepped in. The Japanese crowd erupted. It wasn't just a win, it was a resurrection, a fleeting glimpse of the man who once terrorized Pride. But that fight would be his last great victory. The years of punishment were undeniable, and the sport was moving on. Silva's next chapter would be defined less by what happened inside the cage, and more by a series of controversies that would drag his name through headlines for reasons far removed from his fighting legacy. The spark that had brought him glory would soon be engulfed by a scandal that MMA fans still debate to this day. The trouble began in 2014, during the lead-up to a grudge match with Chael Sonnen. The two had coached opposite each other on The Ultimate Fighter Brazil 3, and their mutual dislike spilled over into a now infamous on-set brawl. For the UFC, the feud was promotional gold, but just weeks before the fight, everything unraveled. Officials from the Nevada State Athletic Commission arrived unannounced to administer an out-of-competition drug test to Silva. What happened next became the subject of years of conflicting narratives. The official version, widely repeated at the time, was that Silva ran from the test, leaving the gym before providing a sample. This led to the harshest penalty ever handed down for such an incident: a lifetime ban from competition in Nevada. But Silva's account told a different story. According to him, the tester had no identification and attempted to take him into a cramped, unsecured room to provide a urine sample and draw blood. Silva claimed he asked to have his attorney review the paperwork first, and when the request was denied, he left to attend a scheduled press event. Supporters argued that this wasn't a case of evading a test. It was about protecting his rights during a process that was new and, at the time, poorly explained to fighters. The damage, however, was done. Headlines labeled him a cheater. Critics called his explanation an excuse. The lifetime ban was eventually overturned, but the stigma stuck. Adding fuel to the fire, Silva released a scathing video accusing the UFC of corruption, underpaying fighters, and manipulating match outcomes. The accusations led to a defamation lawsuit, and while Silva later retracted the statements, his relationship with the UFC was irreparably broken. In one fell swoop, the man who had built a career on fearlessness found himself painted as a fugitive from the sport. Whether you believed the commission's story or Silva's, the controversy marked the end of his time in the UFC. From that point forward, his career would play out on smaller stages, far from the heights where he had once ruled. After the Nevada scandal, Silva's next big platform came in Bellator. In 2017, he finally faced Chael Sonnen in the grudge match that had been brewing for years. The fight itself was anticlimactic. Sonnen used his wrestling to control Silva for 3 rounds and took a decision win. The heat of the rivalry had far outshone the contest itself. In 2018, Silva met Quinton "Rampage" Jackson for the 4th time, this time at heavyweight. It was a fight built on nostalgia, but the outcome was a harsh reminder of time's toll. Rampage knocked Silva out, evening their series at 2 wins each. For many fans, it felt like the true end of the axe murderer era. Outside the cage, Silva began speaking candidly about the long-term effects of his career. He admitted to suffering from memory loss, mood swings, and insomnia, symptoms associated with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. In a move that drew respect from across the combat sports world, he announced his intention to donate his brain to science after his death, hoping to help protect future generations of fighters. Silva even tried his hand at politics, running for Congress in Brazil in 2018, on a platform promoting youth sports and health program. He didn't win, but the campaign reflected a shift in his focus, from inflicting damage to preventing it. In 2024, the UFC inducted Wanderlei Silva into its Hall of Fame. Dana White himself praised Silva as one of the sport's true pioneers, a fighter who helped define MMA's golden age. For fans, the honor was a bittersweet reminder of all the highs and lows. His final record, 35 wins, 14 losses, 1 draw, and 1 no contest, barely scratches the surface of his impact. Silva's legacy is a tapestry of contradictions, an unrelenting destroyer in his prime, a figure mired in controversy, and ultimately, a man who gave everything to the sport, even his own body. The axe murderer may have put down the weapon, but his shadow will forever loom over the history of mixed martial arts.